everyone. Welcome to BetterTech. We're really excited to have Dalan Winbush here with us from Quickbase. We're going to talk today about reducing IT costs without compromising quality. That's the trick. And we're going to get that CIO point of view. So I'm really excited about meeting with you today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dalan, tell us a little bit about what you do every day and what your company does, just to give us some context.
Yeah, certainly. So as you mentioned, Dalan Winbush, I'm the CIO for Quickbase, which is a traditionally a no-code, low-code platform that been there for about a year and a half. My responsibility is really managing IT operations, strategic planning, and project management as well across the organization. And I would typically put it in a position where it's not just your typical IT leader, but a transformational officer of the organization to really drive value across the business. QuickBase has been around for quite a long time. Like I said, it's a no-code, low-code platform, and what we really provide our customers is kind of a toolkit of capabilities that is kind of like think of Legos, right? If you want to solve a problem, what are all the different pieces that you can put together to solve a problem? So being able to bridge some of those big bricks of ERP systems to HRS systems, and you want to orchestrate some sort of a workflow, right? There's not a lot of platforms out there that can be as agile and nimble, and you can virtually build anything out of it, right? It's kind of like citizen development, if you will. And the business is what really drives innovation. That's IT trusted and secured. So that's kind of just high level, and we really are just in the business of reducing the gray areas, the gray space where point systems just can't get to, right?
Yeah, yeah. We used to call that those spaces used to be full of spaghetti code. And so I think a lot
Yes.
of leaders in regular business we're very hungry for the type of solution QuickBase offers that,
Yeah.
kind of unburdens people from who that's not their real job. So they can just very easily automate processes. And the other cool thing about QuickBase is that only the people who are doing this low code know how it works anyway. I find I've done like really large scale data projects, and you go and you're like, Sally, what happens when you're done with this project? And it's like, I definitely send it to John. And then John's like, that definitely isn't what happens. So you really, keeping the automation right there where the people
Yes.
know it best is super valuable. In terms of, what's interesting, you talked about being a driver of strategic changes and transformation in your organization. And also because we're talking about costs, paint a picture for me of like what's happening what's happening for costs in the IT organization, because I bet it's radically changed in the last 6 years.
Yeah, so and we all know what's happening in the micro economics right now with IT and just costs in general, right? So I think number one, the pressures right now is just the investment. IT infrastructure has been really expensive, right? We've seen kind of an evolution of on-premise infrastructures going to the cloud or virtual spaces, where that be co-located. And now we're seeing just the big hyperscalers are really driving a lot of value, being able to move infrastructure where you reduce a lot of your costs, right, from a facilities perspective. Some of the other ones are just the increase of workload, right? There's a huge demand right now, pressure of IT and the cost associated to it. The demand is always going to be more than the supply, right? We're not going to have enough people, enough hands, capacity.
It's traditionally an area of like
Yeah.
very difficult to contain costs. Help, but for users who aren't familiar with the big tech trends, right? Or I'm sorry, listeners who are not familiar with big tech trends, I think talk a little bit about the change from license to consumption-based pricing and how that's kind of caused some. Has that helped you or hindered you or both?
It's both, right? When you have perpetual licensing, you kind of I would call it predictability, right? Driving predictability in IT is really difficult because you're at the will of the business of what they consume, whether that be perpetual licensing, but at least you know exactly what your organization is going to consume based off of headcount and licensing cost. When we get to a consumption model, the consumption model is really about, are we consuming value, right? Do I have a license model that everybody has access to consume? And I'm just going to throw it out there because it's a big elephant in the room. Gen AI, right? Gen
Right.
AI is a big a big consuming platform, right? But are they using it and adding value? Do you see tangible ROI and time the value? So those things can hurt us because we don't know and being predictable about the actual costs associated to the usage and value. So we really have to think about cost models and building governances around these sort of consumption models, especially when you think about Gen AI. Now, there's other consumption models that have a little bit of predictability. It's really about visibility around and getting all the telemetry on how it's being used, when it's being used. It's being used by who in your organization. So you still have some controls that are put in place, but it's really about predictability. And that's, I think, transitions your IT organization to be a really strong from a financial perspective and really understanding the economics of what services are being consumed rather than just being deployed.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think what I'm hearing you say is there's sort of a list of cost drivers that exists. Some change, some of it changes, some of it stays the same. But as you
Yeah,
go through that list, what you're looking for is what's predictable and what's a question mark as a kind of first step. Is that right?
absolutely.
All right. Let's think about that list on the left-hand side of the equation, right? So it's definitely like using data consumption costs, scaling. Those are the things I would expect, licensing costs. One of the things that's traditionally been a driver of cost is people resources, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, yeah, hands-on keyboards, right? Again, when the demand goes up and the supply is low, do you make a decision to say, hey, I need a butt in the seat and hands-on keyboards, or do I lean into automation? Do I lean into self-service? Do you lean into the things that are multipliers across your business where you can actually get more of a one-to-many sort of relationship? And I think that's part of the strategy, right? If you don't have a strong strategy, then you are paying for resources, hands on keyboards to perform those tasks, right? But how do you get the multiplier across your business? And I think that's the trick.
I want to ask you a little bit about cutting costs and how you achieve this like 30% that we reference in the title. But like before we get there, one of the questions I had for you, as you think of your portfolio of activities, I'm just an outsider. I look at the IT organization and I'm like, boy, those guys in cyber, those guys who are doing Gen AI, they get all the budget. But I bet there's other things on your list, right, that you have to kind of defend. So I guess the question really is like, how do you pick where to cut costs?
Sensible budget is part of the science. So it's all about prioritization, and two is it's got to be a business decision, right? There are some cuts and costs that we can make that may make sense to the IT organization, but may have a significant impact to the business. It could reduce quality of service that we're delivering to the business. It could reduce the quality of services from even a vendor based off of different tier levels of product that we purchase, or if we downgrade some of our relationships and contracts. So I think it really depends on what is the overall business value, what are the least amount of disruptions that we can make across the organization, and that's what's really going to determine where can we actually cut the cost. And some of that is more change management as well, right? A
Mhm.
lot of the cost cutting is going to really, I think, impose some stress on the business because it could be a tool that you swap out, or you have overlapping technologies where you have to deprecate one tech and really lean into another, and sometimes there's a lot of change management that gets in that comes to play. So it may not be hard dollars; it could be soft dollars as well, right? Productivity does it can be impacted.
Yeah, change management sometimes is the tipping point between a successful and
Yes.
not successful. But listen, so this is good. We've set the stage, right? We've said that like, hey, figuring out what your costs are and what matters is harder than ever. The pressure in both the general market and most companies is to cut costs wherever possible. And so, okay, we understand that there's some basic inputs and outputs there for you. Let's take it down to like a specific example because you have been focused on a 30% reduction and have a kind of playbook in mind. Is that right?
Absolutely. Again, when you look at the microeconomics, what is the business trying to achieve? What is the bottom line that we're trying to achieve? And it's been a really strong, I would say, in the last 3 years, it's all about EBITDA, right? I think we've gone through a lot of growth pre-pandemic, but how can IT contribute to the EBITDA benchmarks, right? Get to a rule
Can
of
I,
40, get to a rule of
can I,
50.
can I pause you there for a second?
Yeah.
Because if listeners aren't familiar, we can use your business or another one as an example. So I like this. So figuring out like what costs are defensible or not defensible starts with the core business, right? So for your core business, you're saying the most important things are the items that drive earnings.
No, yeah, most important things are not just earnings, right? You got a you got a three-legged stool, right? What do we do to contribute to the top line, which are earnings, or not earnings, but your revenue? How do we control costs, right? And then you balance that, and that's really your earnings and your EBITDA. And then the risk, like how much risk are we preventing or actually contributing to the business as well with some of these decisions?
Yeah, so I think that what you're saying is like sometimes it's different for different organizations. I'll give you an example. Like I work at a startup, you could see maybe less concern about cost reduction and more concern about using like really cutting edge tech. And so it would be almost easier to get budget, right, and cut costs, for compliance software versus, AI supporting software. So I just was curious if you could share an example of like how specifically you can figure out where
Yeah.
to kind of and maybe invest in your portfolio of costs? Like how has that worked for you in the past?
Absolutely. I think number one is, do we have overlapping capabilities? I think every organization, specifically the one I'm at today, is we have a lot of overlapping capabilities, right? Let's talk about the collaboration space,
Yeah, I
right?
work in really,
Everybody.
really big companies where there's just so many duplicates. And there's a one place I worked where I was like, I just wait for somebody to tell me they're doing exactly what I'm doing about once a month. And it's often
Yeah,
true.
yeah. I mean, we have Zoom, right? We have Teams, we have Slack, we have all these other collaboration tools that really kind of do the same thing in different ways, right? I think it's more subjective of what tool that your organization gravitates to. But then when you take on a financial lens, it's like, well, I'm spending, X amount of dollars where it's kind of an expenditure that I'm spending on maybe, if I'm in Teams, it's part of our license agreement, right? So you have to make a hard decision and say, we're going to make a tool change, lean into where the cost is already being consumed in other areas from Microsoft perspective, and we have to deprecate Zoom,
Okay.
right? So those are really big changes. Same thing with Slack, right? These are just overlapping capabilities
Overlapping
that we have to look at an
capabilities, and
organization.
there's overlapping capabilities, and then some stuff you've already paid for. So you want to
Yeah,
continue to do
yeah,
that. Okay. Okay. So that's like the low hanging fruit. And then what's the next step
yeah.
after that?
Long hang. The next step after that is where can we automate, right? I mean, there's a bunch of tools out there that there's a lot of clicks, there's a lot of swiveling between chairs and technologies. So, what can I implement that can help me deprecate one or two or three multiple different applications where I can actually consolidate into one, right? And I think that's where we really lean on the business and try to
Mhm.
understand what does that change look like, and I'll give a really good example on this one is we've had multiple, I would call it ITSM systems, putting in tickets for the IT organization to support the business, right? We've had four different systems. So we got four different systems, but they all don't do this. They all don't really reach the business that we need to. So we deprecate every single one of them. And we bring in Jira, right? Jira kind of consolidates all the things that we need. It integrates with Quickbase, integrates with all of our Slack channels. So those are other decisions that we have to make. It may not be that they're overlapping systems, but we really need to swap out capabilities, have a better pricing model on that license subscription. So those are other ways that we consolidate. And when we think about automation as well, automation comes in multiple flavors, right? Chatbots, things of that nature, Gen AI. Like, how can we implement those into the business? Where again, we can start to look at deprecating other systems where licensing is being consumed.
I like so much of what you're saying. I have several questions. So in terms of like automation, right? I find that a lot of organizations have a long list of things that they would like to automate. One, how do you pick what to automate and backlog the rest? And two, once you do automate, how do you manage the people sides or the softer side of it? Because you inevitably somebody's not going to be happy.
Well, I have a coin phrase of technology is easy, people are hard. And anytime you implement technology, an automation flow or what have you, you have to really lean on the soft side of people. You have to show them the value. they have to understand the why, right? You have to lean into the why first, then you describe the what, and then how this is going to change the world, right? And you got to bring them along the journey. So that's all the soft side. That's all the non-tech pieces of my job and my team's job is just bringing people along the journey and really having them understand the why. I think from an automation perspective and how you choose what to automate and what you choose not to, look, we can find thousands of different use cases across the business to automate anything, right? But it comes back to business value, right? What is the value? What is the radius of impact of that one automation use case compared to another use case? Are you going to touch 90% of your business with this automation capability that has a broader reach and value? Or is it just, 2 to 3 different employees that are going to leverage it, right? So it comes down to business value.
Thought experiment question, and there's no right answer. This is just I'm curious when there's something like this. So let's say you had, 25 wished for automations, right? People from all over the company who said like, these are 25 things we want to automate. Would you pick the like the easiest ones first, or one really gnarly hard one first? Which one? What would you do? The easy
Yeah.
ones? Or, yeah, you know what I'm saying? There's like a debate about this, and I'm always
Yeah,
curious.
there's always a debate, right? Everybody likes the shiny object and the hard ones, right? But I like low effort, high impact, right?
Okay.
And those are the low hanging fruit ones. Those are the easier ones. And then if you move up a little bit more diagonal, there's high effort, high return, right? And
Mm.
those are the shiny objects. Those are the big ones, So you want to balance, right? You don't want to sit in one part of the quadrant or another, but you have to have a balance. You want quick wins, right? The business is looking for deliverables, quick wins, faster time to value. So you have to have a balance. You can't just go after, if I call it an 80-20 rule, let's go after the 80% of the easy use cases, and then let's carve off time where we can, spend our time on the 20% that are really hard, but they're really shiny objects, huge impact on the business, but really big lifts.
That's helpful. Wanted to go back to the deprecation question because I love that story of having multiple systems that somehow were making the job worse. Right? It's not, you would think you would have like double coverage, but things are falling between the cracks. So you put Jira right in place, and I thought that was such an interesting example of how it's both cost saving, but then you're ensuring or even improving the quality. Do you have some other examples that like some of our listeners might want to think about as they're thinking about their infrastructure?
Yeah, I think there's one in particular too. When we think about the new age of identity as the new proxy, authentication, especially after COVID, there's no more castle and moat anymore. Everybody's remote. So what authentication tools are available that cover the full spectrum of your business? I think this is an area where you do have licensing capability on the Microsoft side from an authentication perspective, right? But is it best of breed? Is it the right tool for your business? Is it easy to use? Is it easy to implement and integrate? So we had to make another hard decision and move over to Okta, right? Okta
Mhm.
gave us better flexibility and capabilities and more command and control over employee lifecycle management, right? Not only the authentication piece, but making sure that everyone has the right resources and access to the right resources upon employment. Offboarding, making sure everybody's offboarded as well,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? So there were some trade-offs that we did there, but then we also were able to downgrade some of our licensing with Microsoft and actually come into a net cost reduction by deprecating a tool, moving to another one, and then from a I would say soft dollar perspective, it really enhanced the employee experience and was a multiplier for HR. That they no longer had to wait on IT to onboard or offboard an employee. We can drive everything from the birthright out of the HRS system. So again, I look at the multipliers, but that's another example of a big transformation that we made to be able to deprecate one capability over another.
I want to make sure that we cover more about how to reduce 30% while maintaining quality. One of the things, though, I wanted to ask you about, which might be a little bit of a digression, is when you think of your portfolio of activities, right? Some of them are new, cool stuff, like you're going to do Okta or you're going to automate some stuff. Then the people who do that are going to be heroes inside the company. And then you probably have some dusty projects that are just eat your vegetables work. How do you kind of manage, the people in organizations don't want to work all on eat your vegetables, or they only want to work on new stuff. And how do you kind of help your teams get a wide variety of experiences, or do you take a different view? Just curious to know what your opinion is there.
Yeah, I think it all. I think it comes down to how your organization's the size of your organization, number one, and then how your organization's structured. Let's talk about size. If I come from some other very large, Fortune 10 companies, those companies tend to you just work on one thing, right? You don't have the chance to work on, like you call it the dusty projects. Those
Hmm.
aren't fun. Those are just business as usual. Run the business.
Yeah.
And then maybe seldomly you might get a project that's a really cool project that you get to learn and you kind of exercise some of your innovation skills. Smaller companies, kind of the company, a smaller enterprise where I'm at now, you have a smaller team, right? You can't segment out your team based off of domain expertise. So you have to have everyone kind of jump in and we have to balance out from a capacity perspective, which are some of the business as usual. Those aren't the fun things to work on, but there's always going to be innovation that's swirling around the business that you have to go deliver on. And those are the fun projects. So your staff is going to be more versed in balancing and swirling between those different realms. And I think it's healthy your staff to work on and understand how do you run the business, but then how do you innovate, how do you deploy, how do you manage and get that one technology or that one project into business as usual too. So they see the full life cycle, not just the end of something or the beginning, but they manage the full life cycle.
Interesting. It's good because people you're sort of growing your own cross-functional resources within your own organization, so that can help too. Let's switch gears if you don't mind. I'd love to talk a little bit. Like, let's say I'm a CIO at a different company and I'm thinking about doing this. How do I go about creating a cost reduction program and getting it up and running at my organization? Like just like ten operational steps.
Yeah. I don't know if I would call it a cost reduction program per se. I think it really comes
Step
down
one,
to
market
yeah,
yourself
yeah, yeah.
correctly.
Step one. Don't call it that because I think that sends
That's
your
good.
your 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 stakeholders into a frenzy, right? I think what it comes down to is attaching your IT organization's goals to the business goals. I think is number one, right? Some things may make sense to have some cost reduction. And I think what it comes down to is just like I mentioned, what is the business value? Where are we going to make the most impact, not from just a quality perspective, but against our numbers, against our top line and bottom line. So that's why I don't like to have some big initiative like, hey, we're going to cut, and I've come
Yeah.
from organizations where like, hey, you need to cut 20% out of your budget. What's that going to look like, right? We're going to go through kind of the table stakes. Where do we have, are we right sized in a lot of our areas, right? We have overconsumption in a lot of areas. So it comes down to your vendors. Beating up your vendors is part of the IT role is to reduce costs, get,
That's
80,
that's what I was just
80%,
gonna
80% off of the list price, is kind of where I start, right? And then you right size it from there. I don't need 20%, 30% over consumption just in case, we need it. No, we need a right size. So we have the exact number of expenditures, per license.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm glad we kind of came to this topic is that, in the hugely distributed world of cloud, you've got all these SaaS providers. It's increasingly difficult to even understand where you're at today in terms of real outbound spend, and then, figuring out how to pull back. Have you found any like negotiations one, but like tools or processes that even help you just create like a baseline of what's really happening today? It must be very difficult with all these different modalities.
Absolutely, right. There's some things that we can control, and there's some things called shadow IT, right? And expenses going out the door that you don't have visibility to traditionally. So there's some really cool tools out there, and I'll name drop one specifically by Riverbed. It's called Eternity, and what Eternity does, it allows you to get the full telemetry from the endpoint and the user on what they're consuming. Everything from their laptop, right? That the laptop is another expenditure. Are we right sized on the laptop? Do we need to really refresh that laptop every 3 years? Or are the resources still sustainable for them to use for the next 2 years, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a traditional sense that we have to refresh everything in 3 years, or can we wait 5 years, right? Same thing with what they're consuming. I now have visibility to every application that they're accessing, whether it's on-prem or off-prem. identify that, hey, you have, entitlements or licensing to a particular application and you don't access it maybe once every year, then I aggregate that up across the business. There's some significant savings there. So it gives me real time, real visibility to what the business is actually consuming, and then you have to compare that to what you're actually paying for, and there's significant savings that you can unpack with tools like that give you a lot of aggregated data from a telemetry perspective.
Yeah, that's really an interesting thought because the chargeback is also part of that model, right? Not only if you can understand what people are consuming, just for listeners, a lot of times in big organizations, each line of business has to pay some portion of the cost, and it's very difficult to understand. You're put in the position of asking VPs, like, how much data do you think you're going to use next year? And of course, they have no idea, right?
Yeah, so I think it's important for you to have these utilities and just instrumentation at your fingertips so you can actually build a good cost model, right? This is where IT turns into the CFO office, right? This is where you have to really understand your consumption models, and then you marry that to more of the cost model and being able to forecast. Building in predictability in your business in IT is really difficult if you don't have either the strategy or you have the tools to give you the capabilities.
Okay, interesting. So, let's just take a look at the premise, right? Reducing costs while keeping quality high. What are the do's and don'ts of reducing costs? What are the do's and don'ts of maintaining quality?
This one's hard. The do's and don'ts, reducing cost is making a silo decision within IT without your stakeholders is the biggest no-no.
Let me pause you on that because I
Yes.
think really would help other CIOs, other leaders to know, like, step by step, what do you do? How do you get this socialized? When do you know it's digested?
Absolutely. So again, it goes back to the why, right? We really need to establish the why, establish our linkage back to business objectives, deliverables, and get the business to understand where can we cut. You need to get consensus, right? It may
Mhm.
not be a full demographic vote across the business, but you need your major. You can't bring 100,000 people to vote on something, right? So you need your major stakeholders to weigh in on that one thing that we're suggesting that we need to deprecate or save cost on or swap out tools. And but it's a change management. It's all soft skill. It's nothing to do
I
with
guess
tech.
it's that intersection, right? Because what you're saying is, like, have a good idea that aligns to what people care, like leadership cares about. Okay,
Hmm.
great. Then let's say your CEO, she says, yeah, do that. Sounds great. Then you
Yeah.
kind of have to get those lieutenants signed up. And I mean, my experience has been they're like, I'm just focused on my bonus and my revenue goals. How do you kind of
Right.
engage to, like, get them to listen, or what? Maybe you don't know, but it's different every time. But, like, are there some things that you're like, this is how I go about it that maybe somebody could repeat in their world?
Yeah, I think starting at the top, getting executive sponsorship is key. It's number one, right? So you got to get alignment with your peers and executive sponsorship. The next level down, and I love how you just looked at more of like the SLT or the MLT member who's just like, I'm just worried about my bonus. They're only worried about their function. Well, there's 4 or 5 clicks down. They manage a bunch of individual contributors that are going to be greatly impacted by these decisions, right? Do they truly represent and do they have the capacity to cast down what these changes really mean to the business? So I take that on upon myself and my team to build out material, whether that's town hall material, Slack messages, email messages. We're picking like 5, 6 different vehicles to get the message out of what you need to look for in the next quarter. Here are the changes. Here's what it means for you, and here's where you get to learn more about it. Oh, and by the way, we have a feedback loop channel as well because we do want to hear from you. Right. I think it's really important to open up the aperture to hear from your full organization and then aggregate that data together, all that qualitative data, and understand what are going to be the big challenges that we're hearing before we even go live. What are the big things that we need to focus on before we even go live? So I think that's key. And again, it's just basic change management fundamentals. So then
Hmm.
once we've been able to cascade and bring everybody along, kind of the why and the what and the how and the when, then when you do roll it out, then you need to circle back and go back through those big boulders that were called out from the business. Hey, we're having challenges with X because you made this
Mhm.
decision. We're having challenges with Y. Hopefully, you've already gotten that context and you're able to respond to those pretty quickly. So that's kind of the roadmap in IT change management across the business is
You-
connecting with the business.
You're saying it's like, like sort of oh, everybody knows this, but I really want to point out something that is unique in your perspective, which is this idea of continuously gathering requirements, continuously accepting change. I think a lot of organizations, even very forward-thinking ones, they kind of throw this new thing over the wall, right? They're like, you guys all agreed we're doing this? Great. Here's your enablement package, and I'm on to the next thing, right? And I think in our world today, like it's just very difficult to do that. So good for you. I think that's such a smart way to treat it. Like it's not there's sort of no done. It's more about velocity.
It is, and I love how you put it. It's more of an agile approach, right? You're never done. It's always continuous improvement. You want to go 80% delivered. That's what you committed to, and the other 20% is always going to be continuous improvement, getting feedback. How can we do better? Doing a retrospective, right? And I think that's what builds the trust. And I think that's another component of kind of the playbook is how much trust does IT have with the business? Have you built up enough trust? Do they trust what you're saying? Do they trust what you're going to deliver? Do they trust the value that they're going to get out of it? And it's a journey. And I would say, and humbly, that earlier in my career, and sometimes you move so fast you don't think about that, right? And then you have to repair the relationship because you may have moved too fast without going through those motions and kind of going slow to go fast, right? And that's something that IT sometimes just our brains don't work that way. We're ones and zeros. It's stop and go, right? But there's a lot of
Yeah.
gray in the middle that we have to really consider, and it's the human, it's the person, it's the business of who we really need to focus on, less the technology.
Totally. I mean, I come from the tech side, and you're always like, oh, and also the customer experience. You'll talk about it, and then you kind of
Yeah.
never talk it about it again. You're like, okay, let's get to the serious stuff, right? And
Right.
and all of what you're saying, I think it's interesting. We're talking about like pulling in those line of business VPs as well. I think it's interesting too. You mentioned, kind of making it about enablement for the individuals who work for them, not just about, you have to it's always like, hey, we want to pay your taxes so there's a better school system is a hard sell compared to like pay your taxes. I'm going to get your kid a great education, right? Like it's
Yeah.
specific to them, which I really like what that's, I think very, very good approach on the soft side.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's been recent legislation requiring all technology podcasts to talk about generative AI.
Of course.
So we're not exempt. Actually, I'm super excited to talk to you. Like, I work on Gen AI quite a bit, but I find there's like these theoretical discussions about cost as something that could block adoption, or maybe it won't block adoption because you can just run an LLM on your laptop. There's all these different points of view on how cost is going to affect adoption in enterprise. Actually, as I'm speaking, I'm just realizing, can you just summarize for listeners, like what is the cost discussion with Gen AI?
I'm sorry, what's the cost
What is
discussion?
that cost discussion? Are you familiar with it? That basically you have to run all these models and it takes a ton of GPUs and
Oh
the
yeah.
bill
A-
high,
Absolutely.
right?
I spent a lot of time with NVIDIA and some other partners and understanding, what are all the nuts and bolts behind the scenes that are driving, Gen AI, and you have these semiconductor, companies that are producing all these chips, and there's a tangible cost, right? This is not a search engine. This is not Google. This is not Yahoo. This is real compute that's driving that consumption. So that is part of the model, right? It's not just the cool shiny object in the room, and we're leveraging Gen AI to drive either productivity within our business, but does that productivity outweigh the cost, or does the cost
Mhm.
outweigh the productivity? And that's something that is difficult to manage if you don't have the right tools in place to really understand what that impact is.
What would you go? I mean, now there is no right answer. It may not be part of your current experience, but let's say your CEO is, or it may have already happened. Let's do something with an LLM. Let's do something with generative AI with our, customer support team. How would you go about planning for costs before you implement, or thinking about like what would your process be?
Yeah. So the process be number one, you really need a tool, and there's debates out there of do you go straight to an enterprise level agreement with one of these, generative AI organizations? Or do you go and build kind of an extraction layer that you can attach yourself to any LLM that's out there so that you can remain nimble? Then on top of that, you can actually build an algorithm inside of that particular tool and that extraction layer and really understand what are people using it for? What are the costs associated to it? Because now I have a cost model built into the tool on the back end. And now I can really understand what is my average cost going to be per quarter, per month, so that either we need to back down off it or I can put governors in place too, right? How many tokens is the organization allowed to use collectively, right? And I know exactly then what my cost is going to be every month. Or do I just keep the barn door open, right? I think the other part too is don't throw Gen AI at everything.
Right.
Pick a specific use case that again has tangible value. And I'll use a good example like marketing, right? Marketing does a lot of prospect and company research. Can we ingest and build a large LLM that can ingest a lot of your prospect and company's public information all into one arena, and then marry that back to your CRM and all the data that you have on your customer and or prospect customers, and be able to have personalized messages or any campaigns that you want to orchestrate and send out, and you're building really good content at a fast rate. There's tangible value on that, right? If I'm
Mm-hmm.
spending X amount of dollars per month, but our pipeline coverage is increasing because we're able to touch more prospects and get them, either higher propensity to buy through trial or get that trial information, like that's real tangible investment, right? But we're only doing it for a specific use case. So the model that I really want to implement, then could be argued across other CIOs, is I want to go use case by use case, which is sometimes function by function. And then eventually you might have 10 to 12 different use cases that you've proven out over time. And eventually you will capture the whole business, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't throw Gen AI at everything. You can't boil the ocean. And I think
Yeah.
another good piece of that too is crowdsourcing. You should have some sort of a GPT tool that's internal that you have visibility into what are people using it for, so
Yeah.
that you can look at all the different themes and themes that people are using it for and crowdsource and say 70% of our business is using it for content generation or email generation or things like that. So okay, well maybe this is something that we could institutionalize, build or buy, right? Because we got a bunch of Microsoft co-pilots, craze is happening right now, and so those are just decisions that you have to make. But I think all of those pieces, it's really crowdsource and understand what your business needs are. Find a use case that has tangible business outcomes and business objectives, and that's where you're going to be able to control your cost.
I like so much about what you're saying, and let me just pull in a couple of threads here, which is what you're calling about, what did you just say? Not open source, but having a place for your internal folks to play around and mess with generative AI.
Yeah.
Um,
I would also say in a secure way too. I think that's a really good framing.
That's what I was going to say is like we are actually recommending that to
Secure.
people
Yeah.
because it gets rid of like people sneaking Gen AI into your company, right? Is to have a place that's protected where you're like, hey, you
Yeah.
know what? This is a playground for you, sandbox it out. And so people can really just kind of scratch that itch because everybody wants a piece of this new thing. But it's like it's loosely controlled. So
Yeah.
shine a light on it rather than hide it all. So I actually think that's a really powerful idea that more people should adopt, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I also hear what you're saying too. I think you're saying like, hey, as you kind of move forward carefully, you should focus on like discrete use cases that have subject matter expertise. Don't try and like lay in some massive platform and have it, generalize right from the start, but really start with specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe not to turn too far to the right, which I think this is a really good example of where Gen AI really shows itself in good use cases. And what we've done, like in Quickbase, we have the no code, low code platform that really, you can really go from ideation to MVP in a matter of a month, right? Now, can you build an application using Gen AI just based off of some orchestrated prompts and asking you specific questions of, what sort of data and process flow would you want this application to do? And now you're able to build an application from ideation to MVP within 5 minutes, right?
Mhm.
So So there are some real good productivity, tangible areas where you can deploy Gen AI, but it's got to be measured. It's got to obtain some value. And I think that's the again elephant in the room. You don't want to eat the whole thing at once, but you have to take small bites out of it.
I'm going to wrap it up in just a minute. Please let me know if there's something I haven't asked you so far about reducing costs. Any final words on that? And then I have a fun question for you.
No, I think you've covered a lot of different bases. I appreciate it. So fire away
So it's
on
not
the.
really, I guess it depends on your definition of fun, but I am a big, I love reading up on technology and understanding what's going on. From your perspective, I'd be really curious to know, like, what are some of your go-to sources? Maybe it's a blog or a podcast. Like you've got so many in your role. There's just like you can keep in touch with on top of everything. It's everything is in IT. So like, what kind of sources do you recommend for understanding what's going on? Oh, say
Ground
it one more
access.
time. You broke up. Just say it one more
Oh,
time.
sorry about that. Yeah, I got a lot of sources that I tap into every day. One being I watch Bloomberg, right?
Yeah,
Half of the world, half the money is surrounded around technology, right? And it's real time activity that's happening. And then what I'll do is I'll pivot and I read a lot around Wall Street Journal. Has some
hmm
great articles out there that are very fascinating. A lot of neutral viewpoints as well, right? It's very
Great.
objective. The other is that there's a podcast I listen to probably on a weekly basis. It's CXO podcast
Oh, I don't know that one.
on
I'm
on
gonna read. I'm
YouTube.
gonna check
Yeah,
that out.
it's a fantastic it's a fantastic podcast. It's really short, maybe 30 to 40 minutes each podcast and session, but it really draws in a lot of your C-suite executives across multiple verticals and different industries on their perspective of technology, but from their viewpoint. So you'll get a viewpoint of the CMO, the CFO, of larger organizations around manufacturing. Like, how are they thinking about, IT change management, reducing costs, AI, Gen AI, some of the macro changes that are impacting our ability to spend more. Just a lot of different viewpoints that kind of get outside of like these major themes that we read about on a day-to-day basis, and just brings a live, unique viewpoint
I like
to
that.
some of the conversations. Yeah,
I like that. Sometimes it's the best way to consume news is to hear it from a different personas, because
yeah.
otherwise it kind of turns into noise. So, all right, always good to know what people are reading and listening to. Dalen, thank you so much for coming on to Better Tech, and have a great rest of your day.
All right, thank you.